The small-town courtroom, usually quiet except for the occasional murmur of gossip or the shuffle of papers, buzzed with an almost electric tension that day. Sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, catching on the polished wooden benches, the golden lettering on the judge's bench, and the sleek badges of the police officers seated at the front. It was a case that had gripped the community for months, whispered about in grocery stores, cafes, and at playgrounds. Everyone knew the defendant's name, and most had an opinion on his guilt or innocence. Today, they would see justice unfold, or at least the version of it that the law allowed. The defendant, a man in his 30s, sat rigidly in the middle of the courtroom, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His dark eyes darted nervously from the jury to the judge, then to the prosecution table, where two attorneys were sorting through their documents with clinical precision. The man's shoulders were stiff, and the faint sheen of sweat on his brow reflected both the summer heat outside and the anxiety inside him. He had faced allegations of a serious nature, and the evidence against him had already begun to cast a long shadow over the courtroom. Yet he clung stubbornly to a fragile hope, telling himself that appearances could be deceiving, and that truth had its own unpredictable way of surfacing. In the corner of the room, sitting quietly beside his handler, was a large police dog. The animal was calm, its muscular body relaxed but alert, ears flicking occasionally at the slightest sound. It had been trained extensively to detect narcotics and track suspects, but today it played a different role: observer, silent witness, and an extension of the law itself. The dog's eyes were intelligent, almost human in their attentiveness, and it seemed to sense the gravity of the proceedings more than most of the people in the room. Its handler, a seasoned officer with years of experience in law enforcement, gave it a gentle pat on the head, and the dog's tail swished slightly, a barely noticeable signal of readiness. At the back of the courtroom, near the entrance, sat a small child, a 3-year-old boy, clutching a well-worn stuffed toy. He had been brought by his mother, who was a key witness in the trial, and though he had been instructed to sit quietly, the courtroom was an unfamiliar and overwhelming environment for him. He watched the people around him with wide, curious eyes. His gaze flitted from the solemn faces of the jury to the gavel that sat like a golden sentinel atop the judge's bench. But it was the dog that captured his attention most of all. Its calm presence, its alert eyes, and the occasional twitch of its ears fascinated him more than the arguments, the documents, or even the stern voice of the judge. The gavel struck sharply, echoing through the high-ceilinged room, demanding silence. The judge, a tall woman with a commanding presence and gray streaks in her hair, glanced over her glasses at the assembled crowd. Her voice, firm and precise, carried through the courtroom. Order in the court. We will proceed with the presentation of the evidence. The murmurs died down instantly. All attention shifted to the front, where the prosecution had begun laying out their case. Charts, photographs, and detailed reports were presented, each piece meticulously designed to paint a picture of guilt. The jury leaned forward, absorbing every word, their expressions a mix of concentration and concern. Witnesses were called, each recounting the events leading up to the alleged crime. Their voices were steady, their statements rehearsed, but the weight of the courtroom made even their most confident declarations tremble slightly. Meanwhile, the child's attention remained fixed on the dog. He reached out a tiny hand toward the animal, who glanced briefly in his direction before returning to its vigil. He whispered to his stuffed toy, "Doggy sees everything," as if he understood more than anyone gave him credit for. His mother, noticing his movement, gave him a gentle warning, her voice low but firm. "Sit quietly, sweetie." No pointing or talking. The boy nodded, though his eyes never left the dog. There was an innocence in his focus, a purity of perception that contrasted sharply with the tension-soaked atmosphere around him. The defendant shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clenching further as the prosecution introduced a piece of evidence that made even the seasoned officer beside the police dog nod subtly in acknowledgement. The jury scribbled notes furiously, and the murmurs from the spectators grew louder, barely restrained by the judge's intermittent gavel strikes. Each word spoken by the attorneys seemed to ratchet up the tension. Each glance exchanged between opposing counsel was charged with silent aggression, and each subtle movement of the defendant's eyes betrayed anxiety that had been simmering for weeks. The courtroom's air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. Every sound, the scrape of a chair, the flipping of a page, the shuffle of papers seemed magnified. Even the hum of the air conditioning could not dispel the tension that clung to the room like an invisible fog. Lawyers presented their arguments with precision and fervor, each word carefully chosen to sway the jury's perception. The prosecution emphasized the strength of their evidence, their tone unwavering, while the defense countered with skepticism, pointing to inconsistencies, hoping to plant doubt in the minds of those who held the fate of the defendant in their hands. All the while, the child's perspective remained delightfully uncomplicated. He noticed the way the sunlight glinted off the polished shoes of the lawyers. He was intrigued by the rhythmic tapping of a pencil on the defense table, which seemed almost musical to him. But above all, he was captivated by the police dog, who exuded a presence both calm and powerful. He leaned forward slightly, his little body straining to get a closer look, and whispered again to his toy, "He knows." The simplicity of his observation carried a weight that no one in the courtroom yet understood. Time seemed to slow as the proceedings continued. The child, the police dog, the defendant, the jury all were pieces of a tableau that none of the adults fully appreciated. The defendant's breathing grew shallow, his confidence waning as the prosecution's narrative tightened around him. The jury, immersed in the details of the case, failed to notice the subtle interaction unfolding between the child and the dog. And yet, in the back of the room, the boy's tiny finger began to inch toward the animal, his fascination growing into a gesture that would soon shatter the careful composure of everyone present. No one noticed the slight stiffening of the dog's muscles, the barely perceptible shift of its weight, or the flicker of recognition in its eyes. But the child did. He felt it intuitively, as though the animal and he shared an understanding beyond words. The courtroom, thick with legal drama and adult tension, was on the brink of a moment that would transcend the ordinary. The child's innocence, untainted by bias or fear, was about to intersect with trained instinct, producing a moment that would echo far beyond these walls. And so, the first part of the day unfolded, a careful balance of order and chaos, innocence and tension, truth and anticipation. The stage was set for an event so unexpected that the courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a revelation that no adult could have predicted. Little did anyone know, the quiet, observant child at the back of the room would soon become the focal point of a story that would be recounted in this town for years to come. A story that would begin with a simple point, a pair of small words, and the quiet power of a police dog. The courtroom continued to hum with the quiet intensity of legal proceedings, but in one corner, a small observer remained blissfully detached from the formalities surrounding him. The 3-year-old boy, with his bright eyes and tousled hair, clutched his worn stuffed bear as if it were a talisman shielding him from the gravity of the adult world. While lawyers, jurors, and spectators were absorbed in evidence and argument, the child's focus had long since settled on the police dog sitting a few feet away. To him, the dog was a marvel, more fascinating than the gavel, the courtroom benches, or the towering stacks of papers in front of the attorneys. He watched the dog with wide-eyed fascination. Its fur gleamed under the courtroom lights, each muscle moving with calm precision as it adjusted its posture slightly in response to the smallest of sounds. Its ears twitched at the faint rustle of papers, the whisper of a voice, the subtle shift of a body in the gallery. To the boy, The dog was alive in a way adults didn't seem to notice. It was vigilant, aware, almost magical. He whispered softly to his stuffed toy. "He's listening. He knows everything." The words were innocent, but there was an uncanny accuracy in his observation. The boy's mother, seated nearby, glanced at him periodically, her expression a mixture of amusement and mild exasperation. "Sit still, honey," she murmured, nudging his shoulder gently. "Be quiet. No pointing or talking, okay?" He nodded obediently, though only barely, and quickly returned his gaze to the dog. Despite her warnings, the child's fascination refused to be stilled. He shifted slightly in his seat, trying to inch closer without drawing too much attention. Every step of his tiny fingers along the stuffed bear's fur was a sign of concentration, a signal that he was preparing for something only he understood. Meanwhile, the adults in the courtroom remained absorbed in the proceedings. The prosecutor presented a photograph, pointing out specific details that purportedly implicated the defendant. A defense attorney countered with evidence meant to cast doubt, challenging the validity of witness testimonies and highlighting inconsistencies. The judge monitored the flow with meticulous care, her eyes sweeping over the room to ensure decorum was maintained. Each statement, each counterstatement, was a battle in the silent war of persuasion. But none of these adults noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible interaction unfolding between the child and the dog. The boy's perception of the courtroom was markedly different from that of the adults around him. While they weighed evidence, evaluated demeanor, and calculated legal strategies, he interpreted the world in simple, vivid terms: the glint of sunlight on polished wood, the rhythm of footsteps across the tiled floor, the warmth of the air conditioning against his small hands, and above all, the presence of the dog. To him, the dog was a sentinel, a protector, a creature whose awareness far exceeded that of any human in the room. He could feel the tension radiating from the defendant, the nervous energy circulating among the jury, and yet the dog remained a steadfast center of calm. He whispered again to his stuffed bear, "He's ready." It was a statement made with the certainty only a child could possess, a conviction born of instinct and unfiltered observation. The adults, absorbed in procedural minutiae, would never have interpreted such a statement with the weight it carried. But the dog responded subtly, its muscles shifting slightly, its ears flicking toward a direction that only the boy seemed to understand. In that moment, a silent communication passed between the child and the canine, an understanding that bridged species and ages, unnoticed by anyone else in the courtroom. The defendant's anxiety grew as the trial progressed. He shifted in his seat, tugged nervously at his tie, and occasionally glanced toward the police dog, though he tried to mask his awareness. The prosecution continued to build its case, citing previous records and witness statements that painted a damning portrait of his actions. The defense tried to counter, presenting alibis and alternative explanations, but the tension in the room grew palpable with every passing minute. Every adult in the courtroom was fixated on the narrative of guilt and innocence, yet none of them noticed the extraordinary undercurrent forming quietly at the back of the room. Spectators leaned forward, straining to hear the arguments, their attention bouncing between the judge, the attorneys, and the defendant. Some whispered among themselves, exchanging predictions and judgments about the trial's outcome. Others simply observed in silence, aware that this case would define the tone of justice in their small community. Yet the child's focus remained singular, unbroken by the drama unfolding around him. He watched the dog with an intensity that suggested comprehension beyond his years. To him, the dog was not just a witness, it was a participant, an agent of truth, and the guardian of justice in the room. As the trial progressed, a subtle shift began to occur in the courtroom dynamic. The police dog, previously calm and still, began to exhibit minute signs of heightened awareness. Its posture straightened imperceptibly, its tail twitched, and its ears pivoted toward a direction the boy was now pointing toward. The child noticed the shift immediately, his small hands tightening around his stuffed bear. He whispered under his breath, "He sees him." It was a statement of certainty, a recognition that the dog had reacted to something or someone that the adults were blind to. The mother, sensing the boy's excitement, but not fully understanding it, leaned over and murmured, "I told you to sit quietly." But the boy was undeterred. His fascination had escalated into a quiet determination, a moment of insight that only innocence could afford. In his mind, the dog and he shared a secret, a silent understanding of truth, far removed from the complex layers of courtroom procedure. While the adults argued about evidence, law, and precedent, the child had already perceived a connection, a moment that would soon shift the trajectory of the trial. He glanced at the defendant briefly, noting the slight tremor in his hands and the bead of sweat rolling down his temple. The child's intuition, simple and pure, told him that the man sitting nervously in front of the jury was hiding something. He turned back to the dog, who met his gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. The courtroom, with its tension, arguments, and legal complexities, faded into the background. The dog's eyes reflected calm authority, the kind of authority that the child instinctively recognized as truth. The subtle exchange between the child and the dog intensified. The boy's finger twitched slightly, inching forward as though to make contact, a gesture that carried with it an unspoken command, a recognition of shared awareness. The dog responded with a slight, almost imperceptible movement of its head, acknowledging the child's focus. The courtroom, unaware of the extraordinary interaction taking place, continued its rhythm of argument and counter-argument. Adults assumed that the child was merely fidgeting or playing with his toy. No one suspected that within that innocent gesture lay the prelude to a moment that would soon silence the entire room. And so, in the midst of a tense courtroom, where every word and gesture was measured, weighed, and analyzed, a small child remained a quiet, unassuming observer. His attention, undiverted by the adult concerns of guilt, evidence, or law, was focused entirely on a dog whose presence carried authority beyond human perception. The boy's innocence, unburdened by cynicism or doubt, was slowly setting the stage for an event that would captivate everyone present. What the adults did not yet realize was that justice, in its most unexpected and profound form, was quietly converging in the back of the courtroom, guided by the unassuming eyes of a child and the trained instincts of a police dog. The courtroom had grown hotter, not from the summer sun filtering through the tall windows, but from the mounting tension that pulsed in the air like electricity. Lawyers paced and gestured, papers shuffled, and pens scratched furiously across notebooks, recording every detail of testimony that had already stretched on for hours. The defendant's hands, once clenched tightly, now fidgeted incessantly, fingers drumming a nervous rhythm against his knee. His eyes darted repeatedly toward the police dog, and though he attempted to appear calm, his shifting posture betrayed the anxiety he could not contain. Every muscle in his body seemed tense, straining against the weight of scrutiny. At the back of the courtroom, the child remained completely absorbed in his silent vigil. His small hands clutched his stuffed toy tightly, knuckles white, as he leaned forward slightly, trying to catch every nuance of the dog's movements. Every twitch of its ears, every flick of its tail, every subtle shift in weight registered in the boy's keen observation. He was too young to understand the legal intricacies or the arguments being presented, but he sensed a pattern of quiet, almost imperceptible truth in the dog's reactions. To him, the dog was alive with knowledge, aware of things that none of the adults could see. The defense attorney, realizing the prosecution's line of questioning was gaining traction, adjusted his approach. He emphasized discrepancies, highlighted ambiguities in eyewitness testimonies, and pointed out minor errors in procedural documents. The judge listened intently, occasionally raising an eyebrow at a particularly sharp retort. Spectators murmured softly, some nodding in agreement with the defense, others shaking their heads at what they considered weak attempts to challenge solid evidence. Yet, while the courtroom buzzed with adult interpretations of truth, the child's eyes remained fixed on the dog, unblinking, unwavering. The prosecution continued to press, displaying photographs that captured moments in time, moments the defendant had hoped would never be scrutinized so closely. Each image seemed carefully curated to highlight guilt, each document presented to weave a narrative that painted the defendant as the orchestrator of deception. The jury leaned forward, absorbing every detail, their expressions alternating between curiosity and concern. Yet even they failed to notice the silent communication unfolding in the back of the room between the boy and the dog, a connection that was about to unravel the carefully controlled proceedings. The police dog shifted subtly, its muscles coiling with alertness, though it remained seated with impeccable discipline. Its eyes flicked toward the defendant with a focused intensity that made the boy's heart skip a beat. The child's tiny fingers twitched as if responding to an invisible signal, inching closer to the dog, eager to acknowledge its silent command. He whispered to his stuffed toy, "He knows him," a statement of clarity that carried an almost prophetic weight. In the minds of adults, it was mere childlike babble, but in the realm of instinct, of truth, it was an accurate assessment of the moment. The defendant's posture grew increasingly rigid. Beads of sweat gathered along his temple, and his fingers twisted nervously in his lap. He glanced around the courtroom, searching for reassurance, for a lifeline, but found none. Every gaze seemed accusatory, every subtle movement of the jurors' heads a silent critique. He tried to control his breathing, attempted to maintain composure, but the subtle cues, the slight tension in the dog's body, the unwavering gaze of the child, seemed to pierce through his attempts at facade. Anxiety radiated from him, spreading through the room like an invisible current, unnoticed by most, yet palpable to those attuned to nuance. At the back of the courtroom, the child's fascination deepened into a quiet intensity. His eyes followed the dog's every subtle movement, noting when its ears flicked in the direction of a document, or when its nose twitched at a particular scent. Each gesture of the dog seemed deliberate, meaningful, as if the animal understood more than the humans who prided themselves on logic and reason. The boy whispered again, "He's nervous. He's scared," and though his words seemed simple, they carried an accuracy that unsettled anyone who might have overheard. The truth, in its purest form, was being registered by a child and a dog, unnoticed by the adults orchestrating the drama. The spectators in the gallery grew restless as the trial continued. Whispers circulated. "Do you think he'll get away with it? I can't believe the police caught him. This is the most gripping case I've ever seen in this town." Their speculation filled the courtroom with an undertone of tension, yet the focus of the boy remained unwavering. The child's world had condensed into a single line of sight between himself and the police dog. He did not understand the law, nor the procedures, nor the implications of what was happening. What he understood, instinctively, was the connection between guilt and truth, between subtle behavior and hidden secrets, between the dog and the man whose nerves betrayed him. The judge called for a short recess, and the courtroom momentarily shifted into a quieter rhythm. Spectators whispered, attorneys adjusted their notes, and the defendant leaned back, attempting to regain control over his breathing. But the brief lull did nothing to alleviate the tension. The child remained seated, leaning forward slightly, unshaken by the pause in proceedings. His eyes followed the dog, and he noticed a subtle shift in its stance, a barely perceptible forward lean, a faint gleam in its eye, a recognition of the man whose secrets it could sense. The child's small hands clenched his stuffed toy tighter, as though drawing courage from the object, preparing for a moment he did not yet fully comprehend. When the court reconvened, the prosecution began a new line of questioning designed to corner the defendant further. Witnesses were recalled, each providing nuanced observations of events, details that could tilt the balance of judgment. The defendant squirmed in his chair, his attempts at calm increasingly ineffective. The jury absorbed every word, their attention rapt, their collective perception shaped by the careful orchestration of evidence. And yet, in the back of the room, a small observer and a police dog were noticing the cracks, the micro-expressions, the subtle truths that no document, photograph, or testimony could fully capture. The subtle tension between the child and the dog grew. The boy's finger twitched slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though following an internal rhythm only he could sense. The dog responded, its muscles tensing, its ears flicking toward a subtle movement of the defendant's hand. The interaction was silent, invisible to the human eye, yet profoundly meaningful. In that quiet exchange lay the recognition of guilt, the understanding of deception, the revelation of truth that was about to unfold. The courtroom's air was thick with suspense, the kind of suspense that grips every person in the room without their even knowing why. The defendant's eyes darted to the back of the room for the briefest moment, catching the gaze of the child. The boy looked back steadily, unflinching, unafraid, as if he had already seen something that would soon be undeniable. The dog, too, held its position, eyes locked on the man, aware that something monumental was about to occur. Adults continued their rituals, speaking, gesturing, documenting, unaware that they were mere spectators to a truth being revealed through instinct and innocence. The convergence of child and dog had created a tension far greater than any legal argument, a prelude to the moment that would silence the entire courtroom. And so, the third act of suspense was set. Adults continued to argue, defend, and judge, but the real drama had shifted to the back of the courtroom. The child and the dog, in their silent awareness, were preparing to deliver a revelation that would cut through procedure, pretense, and fear. Every subtle shift, every twitch, every whispered observation by the child was a drumbeat leading to an extraordinary moment, a moment that would soon astonish everyone present and remind them that truth sometimes emerges in the most unexpected forms, through the pure, unfiltered perception of innocence. The courtroom's tension had reached a near palpable level. Lawyers spoke with deliberate precision, their words sharp and carefully chosen. Yet beneath the formal decorum, a silent undercurrent of anticipation ran through the room. The jury leaned forward in their seats, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution, trying to reconcile the facts before them with the undercurrent of human emotion that often colors the pursuit of justice. Spectators whispered among themselves, stealing glances at the defendant and the police dog, though most did not yet realize that a far more extraordinary moment was quietly unfolding at the back of the courtroom. The 3-year-old boy remained in his corner, seated on the edge of his mother's lap, his stuffed bear clutched tightly in his small hands. He had been observing the police dog for what seemed like hours, though in reality it had only been a short stretch of the trial. Every twitch of the dog's ears, every subtle shift in posture, every small movement carried, meaning that the child seemed to instinctively understand. To the adults, it might have appeared that he was simply fidgeting, reacting to boredom or fatigue, but in reality, his focus had grown into an unwavering vigilance, an innocent determination to understand what the dog already knew. As the prosecution presented another carefully curated piece of evidence, a photograph showing the defendant near the scene of the alleged crime, the child's eyes followed the dog's reaction closely. The animal's head tilted slightly, its gaze fixed on the defendant with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the layers of legal argumentation. The boy's tiny hands clenched the stuffed toy more tightly, his thumb brushing nervously against the bear's fabric. He whispered softly to it. He did it, though the words were almost inaudible, meant only for his own understanding. Even so, the conviction in his voice was undeniable. The defendant shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of the subtle scrutiny of the dog, though he tried to hide it. His breathing became shallow, and he adjusted his tie nervously, as if trying to restore composure. The defense attorney continued to interject with arguments meant to cast doubt, but even the most compelling words seemed to falter in the room's thick atmosphere. The jury, spectators, and even the judge felt a subtle shift, a ripple of something undefined passing through the room. It was as though the ordinary tension of a trial had been amplified, focused through the lens of observation that only a child and a trained police dog could perceive. The boy's eyes widened as the dog moved slightly, a faint lean forward that was imperceptible to most adults. He could sense the significance of the movement before understanding it consciously. His tiny hand rose slowly, almost involuntarily, pointing toward the defendant. It was a gesture so simple, so unassuming, yet it carried a clarity that would soon seize the attention of the entire courtroom. The child's gaze met the dog's, and for a moment, the world seemed to contract, leaving only the two of them and the truth they silently shared. Spectators began to notice the gesture, a few adults turning their heads toward the back of the room. "Look," someone whispered. "Is the kid pointing at the dog?" Murmurs spread quickly, curiosity igniting across the benches. Lawyers froze mid-sentence. The judge's gavel hovered, suspended in the air, and the defendant's eyes widened, registering a flicker of fear. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat echoing in the hushed room. What had been a procedural, methodical trial suddenly teetered on the brink of extraordinary revelation, all precipitated by the smallest observer in the courtroom. The child's lips parted, and he whispered, almost instinctively, two words. He did. The clarity of his voice cut through the murmurs, silencing the room immediately. Every adult froze, their attention drawn to the back of the room, to the tiny figure whose words carried a gravity that none could ignore. The defendant's face turned pale, his carefully maintained composure crumbling in an instant. Even the seasoned judge, who had presided over countless cases, blinked in surprise, uncertain of how to respond to such a sudden, piercing observation. The police dog, remaining calm yet alert, gave a subtle nod with its head, almost as if acknowledging the child's statement. Its eyes never left the defendant, holding an intensity that confirmed what the child had just articulated. The courtroom went silent, an almost tangible hush, as every person processed what had just occurred. Witnesses leaned forward, jurors exchanged bewildered glances, and attorneys paused mid-gesture, realizing that the simplest words from a 3-year-old had shifted the room's energy in a profound, undeniable way. The defendant's hands trembled as he realized that the child's observation, combined with the trained instincts of the police dog, had pierced the veil of his carefully maintained facade. He tried to speak, to assert control, but his voice faltered, caught between fear and disbelief. The defense attorney exchanged a glance with him, unsure how to navigate a moment that was entirely unanticipated. In that instant, logic and evidence seemed to give way to intuition and perception, as the room collectively registered the power of innocence, intersecting with trained instinct. Spectators whispered in hushed tones, their curiosity now mingled with astonishment. Did the kid just... One woman murmured, unable to complete her thought. Others simply shook their heads, unable to reconcile what they had witnessed. Even the judge, trained to manage chaos and surprises, found herself momentarily taken aback. She raised the gavel, attempting to restore order, but the silence lingered, heavy and reverent. Every eye in the room, whether juror, lawyer, or onlooker, was now fixed on the child and the dog, recognizing perhaps subconsciously that a pivotal moment had arrived. The child, still pointing, seemed almost unaware of the weight of his words. He did not understand the legal ramifications, nor the societal impact, nor the fear his declaration had instilled in the defendant. To him, It was simple. He had observed something, the dog had confirmed it, and he had spoken the truth. The purity of this perspective, unburdened by cynicism or calculation, carried a force that adults, with all their experience and knowledge, could scarcely match. The police handler, standing quietly nearby, gave the dog a subtle nod, acknowledging the synchrony between canine intuition and childlike perception. Though trained to remain composed, the handler's heart raced with the recognition of the extraordinary timing. The dog, fully aware of its surroundings, responded with a subtle, disciplined adjustment of posture, signaling readiness to act if necessary. The courtroom, meanwhile, remained suspended in collective disbelief, each second stretching longer as the reality of the child's words settled in. Even as murmurs began to ripple through the room, the child's gaze never wavered. He remained focused on the dog and the defendant. The simplest gesture, a finger pointing, carrying more weight than any argument, document, or photograph. The tension in the courtroom reached a crescendo, the culmination of hours of testimony and observation, now crystallizing in two innocent words. He did. Those words, so simple in their form, reverberated throughout the room, binding together the instincts of the police dog, the observations of the child, and the unspoken recognition of truth by all who bore witness. The defendant slumped slightly, the color draining from his face. His carefully constructed defenses, his attempts at rationalization, his reliance on procedural maneuvering, all seemed trivial in the face of this unforeseen revelation. Every instinct in his body screamed that he had been seen, that the quiet, watchful eyes of a child, reinforced by the keen perception of a trained dog, had pierced the veneer of his deception. He opened his mouth to speak, but found that words failed him. The room had already recognized a truth that no argument could obscure. The judge finally brought the gavel down with a soft but firm strike, restoring a semblance of order. "Order! Order in the courtroom!" she commanded, though the silence lingered, heavy and reverent. Jurors straightened in their seats. Witnesses glanced nervously, and spectators held their breath. All attention had shifted, entirely and irrevocably, to the small child whose gesture and words had transformed a tense trial into a moment that would be remembered far beyond the walls of the courtroom. For the first time that day, the courtroom experienced a pause, not prompted by legal procedure, but by the extraordinary intersection of innocence and instinct. The child's simple act of pointing finger and two words had shifted the dynamics of the trial, leaving every adult present to reconsider their assumptions, their expectations, and even their understanding of justice. And so, in that moment, time seemed to hold its breath. The child, the dog, and the defendant formed a triangle of awareness that transcended the ordinary, reminding everyone in the room that truth often manifests in the most unexpected and profound ways. The courtroom, filled with tension, anticipation, and awe, now awaited the unfolding of the consequences of this extraordinary, silent revelation. He did. The courtroom seemed to inhale sharply and hold its breath, as though those two small words had replaced all other sounds, all other considerations. Every eye, every ear, every mind shifted instantly toward the back of the room where the 3-year-old boy sat, pointing his tiny finger at the police dog, whose gaze remained fixed on the defendant. The sheer clarity and audacity of the statement uttered by someone too young to understand legal nuance swept over the room like a gust of wind through a quiet house. In a single moment, the carefully orchestrated rhythm of the trial shattered. The defendant froze, his knuckles turning white as they clutched his lap. His lips parted, as though he had words to say, yet none could escape. The two words, spoken so plainly and with such conviction, seemed to bypass all legal defense, all argument, all rationalization. The witnesses, mid-testimony, glanced toward the back of the room, their voices faltering. Even the most composed attorney paused, pen hovering above paper, papers fluttering with the arresting weight of truth. The judge, trained to maintain order and decorum, leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, some whispering, some shaking their heads, others simply frozen in place. A few had to bite the inside of their cheeks to prevent audible gasps. The air in the room thickened, becoming almost viscous, as though every molecule was charged with anticipation and awe. Everyone present understood, instinctively, that this was a moment out of the ordinary, a disruption of the usual patterns of human expectation. Adults, accustomed to measuring credibility by years, experience, and authority, were forced to reckon with the unfiltered perception of a child. The police handler's hand rested lightly on the dog's head, but his eyes betrayed his astonishment. The dog had remained calm, trained to perform without emotional display, yet it had subtly responded to the child's gesture, confirming the truth of his statement. The handler exhaled slowly, aware that the connection between child and dog was no longer just an isolated moment. It was a revelation with tangible consequences. Every instinct in his professional experience told him that this was extraordinary, that the combination of innocence and trained intuition had uncovered a reality the courtroom had not anticipated. The defendant's color drained completely from his face. His attempts to compose himself faltered. The sweat glistening along his forehead reflected the dawning realization that he had been seen, truly seen, in a way that no documentation or witness statement could obscure. He opened his mouth to speak, to reclaim control, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. The authority of the courtroom, normally reliant on procedures, rules, and eloquence, had been superseded by the simplest form of truth, a child pointing and declaring it aloud. Murmurs rippled through the spectators. Did he really just say that? One woman whispered, her voice barely audible. A 3-year-old? Another asked, eyes wide with disbelief. Journalists in the back of the room fumbled to jot down notes, sensing that this moment would become the story of the week, if not the year. Cameras were forbidden in the courtroom, but if they weren't, every lens would have captured the incredulity, the astonishment, the raw emotion frozen on every face. In that instant, the child's innocence transformed the room, bringing to light a reality that adults had struggled to demonstrate with evidence and testimony for hours. The jury sat in stunned silence, pens paused mid-note, their collective gaze shifting back and forth between the child and the defendant. Jurors were trained to rely on evidence, to weigh testimonies and documents carefully, to separate emotion from fact, but no training could prepare them for the clarity of a 3-year-old pointing and speaking a truth confirmed by a police dog. Their minds raced, trying to reconcile procedural expectations with the extraordinary observation that had just occurred. It was an unusual, almost magical convergence. Innocence, instinct, and trained perception, all aligning perfectly in a single instant. Witnesses who had already testified fidgeted nervously, uncertain of how this new element would influence their own credibility or recollection. Some exchanged glances with attorneys, seeking silent guidance, though none could provide reassurance. The child, oblivious to the storm he had unleashed, simply remained seated, pointing, and holding the stuffed toy close. His wide eyes reflected focus and clarity rather than fear or uncertainty. In his mind, he had simply spoken the truth, unaware of the weight it carried in a room filled with adults, consumed by formalities and assumptions. Even the judge, the embodiment of authority and experience, allowed herself a moment of astonishment. Her gavel rested lightly in her hand, poised to restore order, yet the room was already suspended in a rare silence, a reverence that no authoritative strike could command. The words of a child, so simple and unadorned, had eclipsed the normal flow of legal proceedings. The courtroom had shifted from a structured environment of debate and logic to one suspended in awe and the recognition of an unexpected, undeniable truth. The police dog shifted slightly, responding with a subtle, disciplined motion, its ears twitching at the faintest indication of the defendant's nervous movement. The child's finger remained pointed, unwavering, and his tiny voice carried clarity beyond his years. He did. That brief utterance, repeated only once, had created a seismic shift. Adults, trained in law and experienced in human behavior, realized they were witnesses to something profoundly rare: the intersection of instinct, innocence, and justice in a moment so pure that no argument could dilute its impact. The defendant's attempts at composure crumbled further. His lips trembled, his eyes darting helplessly around the room, but every glance returned to the child and the dog. He understood finally that this was not a coincidence, not a random observation, not an interruption he could ignore. His guilt, which had been masked with careful defense and procedural maneuvers, was now reflected in the clarity of a child's statement, reinforced by the dog's instinctive behavior. Every legal strategy he had relied upon seemed to pale in comparison to the undeniable truth spoken so simply at the back of the room. Spectators were now fully engaged, leaning forward, some gripping the edges of their seats. A collective hush settled, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Even those who had doubted the prosecution's case could not ignore the striking resonance of the moment. A 3-year-old, unaware of legal nuance or societal pressure, had pointed out a truth that adults struggled to demonstrate through hours of argument. The power of innocence, combined with the intuition of a trained police dog, had created a tableau of revelation that seemed almost cinematic in its precision. The defense attorney whispered under his breath, muttering to himself as he struggled to comprehend the unfolding drama. This changes everything? His usual confidence faltered, replaced by the raw recognition of a moment that no strategy could preempt. The courtroom was no longer merely a site of debate. It had become a stage where truth revealed itself in its most unfiltered form. Each observer understood that the 2 words spoken by a child, simple yet profound, had altered the dynamics of the trial irrevocably. The judge finally spoke, her voice measured but tinged with amazement. "Let us proceed carefully," she said, though her eyes lingered on the child and the dog. "We will consider the proceedings in light of all observations." The words were procedural, but the underlying acknowledgement was unmistakable. The room had witnessed something extraordinary. Witnesses adjusted nervously in their seats. Jurors scribbled furiously, yet hesitated, and the defendant slumped, the reality of exposure pressing down with unbearable weight. Meanwhile, the child remained calm, almost serene, oblivious to the magnitude of what he had done. To him, the moment was simple, logical, and clear. He had seen, he had observed, and he had spoken. The dog, silent but assertive, remained alert, its eyes unwavering. In the union of their attention, the child's unfiltered perception and the dog's trained instinct truth had emerged in its purest form, bypassing rhetoric, procedure, and adult sophistication. The courtroom, tense and now humbled, could only bear witness. And so the moment lingered, heavy and profound. A child, a dog, and 2 words had transformed a courtroom into a stage of revelation. Adults, trained to measure credibility, weigh evidence, and parse testimony, found themselves at the mercy of innocence and instinct. The defendant's fate, once wrapped tightly in procedural defenses, was now exposed under the piercing simplicity of observation. The courtroom, united in silent astonishment, had witnessed a phenomenon rare and unforgettable, a reminder that truth sometimes emerges from the most unexpected voices. The courtroom was frozen in a rare, profound silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of a juror, adjusting in their seat, or the faint creak of polished wooden benches. The words, "he did," had not only stopped conversation, they had halted thought, frozen motion, and shifted the focus of every human in the room toward a 3-year-old child, and a police dog. The power of two small words, spoken with the clarity of innocence and reinforced by the dog's trained instincts, rippled outward, touching everyone from the judge to the last row of spectators. The defendant's face was ashen, eyes wide with disbelief, a tremor running through his fingers as they clutched the edge of the bench. He had come to the courtroom prepared for argument, ready with rehearsed rebuttals, meticulous records, and legal technicalities. But none of these tools could withstand the sudden, piercing clarity of a child's observation. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but the room's attention, the weight of the moment, and the certainty of the dog's alert gaze left him unable to articulate a single word. Every instinct screamed that he had been seen, truly seen, and that the veil of his calculated composure had been torn away. The jury, usually trained to focus on evidence and testimony with analytical detachment, found themselves grappling with something entirely unquantifiable. Their eyes darted between the child, the dog, and the defendant, trying to reconcile the legal constructs they had been trained to follow with the reality unfolding before them. Pens hovered mid-air above notepads, scribbles paused in time. Even seasoned jurors, accustomed to weighing conflicting accounts, could not ignore the stark, unmediated truth represented by the alignment of a child's innocent perception and the dog's instinctive recognition. Spectators whispered nervously, their murmurs building like a low, tense hum. Some shook their heads in disbelief, unable to process the unfolding scene. Others leaned forward in rapt attention, silently urging the adults to pay heed to what they were witnessing. Cameras were absent, but every human mind present became a living record of the moment. A child pointing, a dog acknowledging, and a courtroom caught in suspended awe. Ordinary courtroom protocol had been eclipsed by an extraordinary, almost cinematic intersection of innocence and intuition. The police handler, standing a few feet from the child, felt the extraordinary weight of the moment in his chest. Years of experience with dogs trained for detection, obedience, and law enforcement had never prepared him for a scenario like this. The dog, remaining perfectly disciplined, had responded to subtle cues the child had registered before anyone else. Its ears flicked, nostrils flared slightly, tail tensed just so all disciplined responses that betrayed awareness. The handler could feel the ripple of certainty in the air. The child's observation aligned perfectly with the dog's instincts, creating an unspoken confirmation of the defendant's guilt. A defendant's lawyer shifted uneasily in his chair, flipping through notes and glancing at precedent cases in search of a lifeline. But the courtroom's collective attention, now fully fixed on the child and the dog, rendered procedural arguments almost irrelevant. The weight of observation, the unfiltered truth of instinct, and the clarity of perception had broken through the carefully constructed defenses. The attorney whispered to himself, voice tight, "I don't know how to argue against this." As if even the most sophisticated legal training faltered in the presence of a 3-year-old simplicity. Witnesses who had testified earlier now whispered among themselves, glancing at the child, the dog, and the defendant in silent astonishment. Some felt relief. Others experienced doubt. The child's 2 words had shifted the entire context of the trial, adding a new dimension that no documentation, photo, or testimony had been able to convey. They now understood that human perception, even when guided by experience and intelligence, could be limited. In contrast, the purity of a child's attention and a dog's instinct provided an unfiltered truth, impossible to fabricate or distort. The murmurs grew louder as spectators, drawn into the drama unfolding before them, began exchanging astonished observations. "I can't believe a child just said that," whispered one. "And the dog? It's like it knew," another added. The combined effect of innocence and trained animal instinct had created a tension that no adult had been able to anticipate. It was a rare convergence, one that challenged every assumption about observation, judgment, and the ways truth could manifest. The jury, now fully attentive to the new element, began to reevaluate the testimony, reviewing in their minds the evidence, witness statements, and photographs. Each juror weighed the child's observation, considering it alongside the dog's behavior. Unlike other pieces of evidence, this was immediate, instinctive, and beyond manipulation. No one could coach a child to speak the truth in such a precise moment. No one could train a dog to respond with such subtlety and accuracy to cues invisible to the human eye. Together, they had created a synergy of perception and insight that shifted the entire courtroom dynamic. The defendant's reaction grew more pronounced. His composure, already fragile, began to fracture. Small beads of sweat rolled down his temples, and his hands trembled visibly. Every glance he cast toward the back of the room toward the child and the dog reinforced the undeniable truth that had been delivered in 2 words. He had hoped to control the narrative, to influence perception, and to sway judgment through logic, legal argument, and procedural detail. But now, the most powerful force in the room was untainted by argument, unclouded by bias, pure observation, articulated in a child's voice and corroborated by instinctive canine recognition. Even the judge, a veteran of countless trials, felt the weight of the moment press upon her authority. She adjusted her glasses and exhaled slowly, reminding herself to maintain procedural control even as the courtroom collectively acknowledged something extraordinary. She had presided over difficult cases, moments of intense emotion, and dramatic revelations, but nothing prepared her for the intersection of innocence and instinct playing out in front of her eyes. The gavel remained poised in her hand, but its usual authority seemed secondary to the truth revealed by a child and a dog. The child, meanwhile, remained composed, almost serene. He did not understand the societal, procedural, or legal implications of what had occurred. He had simply observed, pointed, and spoken what he believed to be true. To him, it was logical, simple, and obvious. His clarity contrasted sharply with the flustered adults around him, who struggled to process and respond to an event that defied their expectations. The dog's subtle nod and alert posture reinforced this perception, confirming the child's statement without the need for any additional evidence. The courtroom's collective consciousness was now fully focused on the intersection of these 2 forms of perception, innocence and instinct. Adults, with all their training and knowledge, were left to observe, reflect, and adapt to the extraordinary alignment before them. Witnesses, jurors, and spectators understood instinctively that the 2 words spoken by a 3-year-old, corroborated by the dog's trained attention, had shifted the trajectory of the trial in a way that would not soon be forgotten. The defendant, now visibly shaken, attempted a weak protest, muttering something indistinct under his breath, but no one heard. The room's attention remained fixed on the child and the dog, and the impact of that attention left little space for distraction or argument. In that moment, the courtroom had transformed. It was no longer merely a place of law and procedure. It had become a theater of truth, a space where observation, instinct, and innocence converged to reveal what logic and evidence alone could not. The police handler, sensing the room's heightened awareness, gave the dog a gentle nod, acknowledging the subtle power of the animal's response and the child's perception. The dog, ever disciplined, remained alert but calm, its trained instincts aligned with the innocence and honesty of the child's observation. Together, they had created a force that neither authority, argument, nor rhetoric could challenge. The courtroom was, in effect, powerless to resist the clarity of truth presented so simply and decisively. And so, the shockwaves continued to ripple through the courtroom. Witnesses whispered in disbelief. Jurors exchanged tentative glances. Spectators leaned forward with wide eyes, and the defendant sat paralyzed, caught between fear, realization, and helplessness. The child, unaware of the chaos his observation had triggered, remained seated, pointing, and quietly clutching his stuffed toy. In that simple act, gesture and voice combined, the courtroom had witnessed a rare and profound truth, that sometimes the most unassuming participants, guided by innocence and instinct, can reveal what even the most seasoned adults cannot. The moment lingered, heavy and profound. A 3-year-old child and a police dog had created a resonance that stretched beyond legal arguments and witness testimonies. In that room, for that moment, truth had taken on a tangible form, immediate and undeniable. Adults, trained to judge and evaluate, were now forced to reckon with the power of observation unfiltered by experience, calculation, or bias. After the child's quiet yet astonishing declaration, the courtroom remained suspended in disbelief. For several moments, nobody dared to speak. The air, already heavy with tension, now carried a charged weight of awe and uncertainty. The defendant, slouched in his chair, looked as though he had been physically struck. His face was pale, lips parted in shock, and hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the bench. The child's 2 words had done what hours of testimony, evidence, and cross-examination could not. They had exposed him fully, in a way that was undeniable. The judge, a veteran of hundreds of trials, raised her gavel to restore order, though her eyes betrayed the astonishment that coursed through her mind. She was aware that nothing in procedural law accounted for this unusual intersection of perception, instinct, and innocence. "Let us proceed carefully," she said, her voice firm but measured, acknowledging the extraordinary nature of the moment without allowing it to descend into chaos. Her command was both practical and symbolic, a recognition that the trial had shifted irreversibly. The police handler stepped forward, his calm demeanor masking a deep awareness of the courtroom's shift. He knelt slightly beside the dog, speaking softly, and gave the animal a gentle touch that signaled both acknowledgement and affirmation. The dog, trained to detect subtle cues and maintain discipline, responded with an imperceptible nod, confirming the child's observation without a word. Witnesses leaned forward, jurors glanced at one another with wide eyes, and even some spectators were moved to whispers of disbelief. What had been a routine procedural moment had turned into a collective recognition. The child had seen the truth, and the dog had confirmed it. The prosecution, initially hesitant, seized the opportunity. They requested a brief recess to allow the courtroom to absorb what had occurred, to verify the dog's reactions, and to realign the sequence of evidence. Legal protocol required that any extraordinary events be formally documented, particularly when involving testimony confirmed by trained police animals. The judge nodded, acknowledging the request, and the room shifted into an almost surreal rhythm of anticipation and reflection. During the recess, a few spectators whispered fervently among themselves, "Did that child just solve the case?" One woman murmured, her eyes still fixed on the boy. "And the dog? It's like it knew." Another replied, shaking her head. In hushed tones, people speculated about what they had witnessed. The child, unaware of the impact of his words, played quietly with his stuffed toy, still pointing occasionally at the dog as if maintaining a silent dialogue. To him, it was simply logic. He had noticed the signs, and the dog had confirmed them. The simplicity and clarity of his understanding contrasted starkly with the astonishment of the adults around him. The police handler, speaking quietly to the judge and the attorneys, described the dog's behavior in precise detail. Every muscle shift, ear flick, and subtle movement had indicated recognition of the defendant's guilt. In law enforcement terms, it was a form of non-verbal, instinct-based confirmation, something used regularly in investigations, but rarely observed in such a formal courtroom setting. The attorneys absorbed the information, realizing that the alignment between the child's observation and the dog's instinct had created a compelling, nearly irrefutable indication of truth. The defendant, realizing that the focus had shifted irreversibly toward the child and the dog, attempted to regain composure. He whispered to his lawyer, searching for any procedural loophole or strategy that could mitigate the impact of the observation. But the truth, delivered without bias, argument, or artifice, could not easily be countered. The child's innocence and the dog's trained instincts had bypassed every traditional safeguard the defense had relied upon. For the first time, the man appeared vulnerable not to legal technicalities, but to the simplest, most powerful form of perception: observation of reality. When the trial resumed, the judge instructed the courtroom to focus on documented evidence while acknowledging the extraordinary observation of the child and the police dog. Witnesses were recalled, some hesitantly, and asked to review their prior statements in light of the new development. Each testimony, previously weighed in isolation, now acquired new significance. In subtle ways, the courtroom's perception of the defendant began to align with the intuitive recognition already apparent in the child and dog. Every gesture, hesitation, and expression of the defendant was now amplified under scrutiny. The jury, still absorbing the unusual events, found themselves influenced subtly by what they had observed. Trained to follow the law and evaluate evidence carefully, they now also had to account for a powerful psychological factor: the combination of innocence and instinct. The child's simple words, combined with the dog's disciplined response, introduced a nonverbal yet compelling layer of evidence. Jurors leaned forward, considered micro-expressions, and reviewed the sequence of events with renewed attention. The ordinary rhythm of deliberation was replaced with an acute awareness of behavioral cues, a dimension of truth that procedural evidence alone had not captured. The prosecution moved to reintroduce previously overlooked details, connecting them to the child's observation. Small inconsistencies in the defendant's testimony, subtle signs of nervousness, and overlooked evidence suddenly appeared far more significant. The defendant's lawyer attempted to redirect attention toward procedural technicalities, but even the most methodical arguments were now filtered through the lens of the extraordinary observation. Adults, trained in law and rhetoric, realized that a child and a dog had introduced a force that no procedural maneuver could easily overcome. Spectators whispered, leaning forward in anticipation. "It's like the courtroom just shifted," one woman said. "A kid and a dog. They just changed everything." Across the benches, murmurs of astonishment blended with a sense of recognition. The truth had emerged in a rare, almost poetic form. Witnesses glanced toward the child and the dog, some smiling nervously, others reflecting on the uncanny timing of the observation. The courtroom, normally dominated by rhetoric and procedure, had become a stage where instinct and innocence revealed a hidden layer of reality. The defendant, feeling the weight of observation, realized that the alignment between child and dog could not be disputed. Every attempt at composure faltered. Even the most calculated arguments seemed trivial compared to the clear, unmediated perception displayed by a 3-year-old and a trained canine. He shifted in his chair, eyes darting toward the back of the room, acknowledging a truth he could not articulate, and understanding for the first time the vulnerability that had been created in an instant. The judge, regaining her professional composure, reminded the courtroom of procedure and the importance of relying on documented evidence. Yet she, too, was aware that the ordinary dynamics had changed irreversibly. Every participant in the courtroom, the jury, spectators, attorneys, witnesses, was now considering events through a new framework, one that combined observation, instinct, and innocence. This rare convergence had altered perceptions, reshaped judgments, and set the stage for a resolution unlike any ordinary trial could produce. The police dog, remaining seated but vigilant, provided silent reinforcement of the child's observation. Each slight movement, each subtle shift in posture, mirrored the instincts that had already guided the child's perception. It was as if the animal had silently validated the boy's intuition, confirming that the truth lay where the child had indicated. Together, they had created an alignment of perception that no adult could fabricate, challenge, or manipulate. As the trial proceeded, the courtroom began to move toward resolution. Witnesses, jurors, and attorneys integrated the extraordinary observation into their understanding of the case. The child remained seated quietly, pointing occasionally at the dog, blissfully unaware of the significance of his role. The dog maintained its disciplined posture, eyes alert, tail twitching only subtly, a silent partner in the revelation. The courtroom, once tense and procedural, had transformed into a theater of instinctive truth, where the most unlikely observers held the power to illuminate reality with stunning clarity. The courtroom had transformed entirely. What had begun as a routine legal proceeding had become a stage for a rare and extraordinary demonstration of truth. The innocent observation of a 3-year-old, validated by the trained instincts of a police dog. The defendant, once confident in his strategy, now sat pale and trembling, fully aware that the veil he had maintained was irreparably torn. Every subtle movement he made, every flicker of expression, was magnified in the minds of the jurors, colored by the alignment of innocence and instinct he could not deny. The judge, attempting to maintain control, called the court to order once more. "We will proceed with careful consideration of all testimony and evidence," she said, her voice firm yet tinged with a rare acknowledgement of the extraordinary circumstances. She had witnessed many courtroom dramas, but few moments had matched this combination of simplicity, clarity, and insight. Adults, trained in law, debate, and procedure, had been humbled by a force far beyond technical expertise, the unfiltered perception of innocence, amplified and confirmed by the dog's trained awareness. Jurors exchanged glances, pens hovering uncertainly above their notebooks. They had been trained to weigh evidence and evaluate credibility, but now they faced an additional factor, a child's perception validated by instinct. The boy's simple words, "He did," carried weight far beyond his age, and the dog's subtle but precise reactions had confirmed the accuracy of that observation. Each juror processed this silent evidence differently. Some relied on it heavily, others incorporated it cautiously, but all recognized its significance. The trajectory of the trial had been altered irreversibly. The defendant's attempts to regain composure were futile. Every time he looked toward the back of the room, he caught the unwavering gaze of the child, the quiet intensity of the dog, and felt the undeniable weight of truth. His carefully rehearsed arguments, his meticulously prepared documentation, and his reliance on procedural loopholes all seemed trivial in comparison. The child and the dog had created an unassailable observation, one that could not be challenged, argued against, or diminished. He had been exposed not by eloquence, but by clarity and instinct. The prosecution carefully reintroduced previously overlooked details, connecting them directly to the child's observation and the dog's confirmation. Minor inconsistencies in the defendant's statements now gained greater significance. Hesitations, glances, and subtle body language that had once been dismissed as ordinary nervousness were now viewed in the context of the child and dog's extraordinary alignment. Witnesses were asked to clarify their observations, and the sequence of events was reviewed with renewed attention, emphasizing how the intuition displayed at the back of the courtroom intersected with documented evidence. Spectators leaned forward, whispering in disbelief and awe. Some covered their mouths with their hands, stunned that a child and a dog had shifted the entire courtroom dynamic. Others shook their heads slowly, trying to process the implications of what they had witnessed. Cameras were absent, but every mind present was now a living record of a moment that defied expectations, where truth had been revealed through the unfiltered perception of a 3-year-old. and the instinctive awareness of a trained animal. The child, oblivious to the magnitude of the scene, remained seated, pointing subtly at the dog and clutching his stuffed toy. To him, it was simple. The dog had noticed something important, and he had repeated it aloud. He did not understand the legal weight, the societal implications, or the astonishment of the adults. He only knew that he had seen, observed, and spoken what was true. The purity of his perception was what made it so powerful. Innocence, combined with instinct, had created a force that no amount of argument could undo. The police dog continued to sit vigilantly, disciplined and alert. Every subtle twitch of its ears, every minor shift in weight, reinforced the truth the child had articulated. The dog's presence was not merely symbolic. It was an active participant in the revelation. Its training had prepared it to detect deceit, fear, and other subtle cues invisible to most humans. That expertise, combined with the child's acute observation, created a synergy that transformed the courtroom from a place of argument into a theater of undeniable truth. The defendant's lawyer whispered nervously to him, realizing that conventional strategies were no longer effective. Procedural challenges, alternative interpretations of evidence, and rhetorical flourishes were all overshadowed by the clarity of the moment. The defendant's guilt, once potentially disputable, now appeared undeniable. Every adult in the room could see it. The combination of instinct and innocence had bypassed every shield he had relied upon, leaving him fully exposed. Witnesses, now called to confirm details previously stated, found their recollections suddenly framed in the context of the child and dog's revelation. Hesitations became admissions, discrepancies gained weight, and every small gesture of the defendant seemed to confirm the observation. The courtroom's energy shifted from procedural tension to near reverent acknowledgement. This was not merely a trial anymore, but a demonstration of truth in its purest form, emerging from the most unlikely sources. Finally, the jury began its deliberation with a profound sense of responsibility. The child and the dog's alignment had added a layer of clarity that could not be ignored, shaping their discussion, influencing interpretation, and providing a new lens through which to evaluate all prior testimony and evidence. The jurors debated not just facts, but the implications of instinct and innocence as forms of perception. It was a rare convergence. Human reason and intuition, procedural law and unfiltered observation, combining to reveal the heart of the matter. Minutes stretched into hours as the jury reviewed, discussed, and deliberated. The defendant remained in his seat, pale and quiet, fully aware that the process had shifted against him in a way that was unprecedented. His fate was now tied not only to procedural and factual evidence, but also to the resonance of the child's observation and the dog's disciplined acknowledgement. Each subtle motion, each micro-expression, had become a weight in the balance of justice. Finally, after careful deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. Their expressions were serious, reflecting the gravity of the decision they had reached. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict, and spoke with deliberate clarity. The defendant's eyes widened, hands tightening as he braced for the outcome. The words that followed were met with a mix of relief, astonishment, and quiet awe by those present. The child, still seated with his toy, watched the proceedings with wide eyes, unaware that his simple gesture and words had played a pivotal role in reaching this moment. The judge acknowledged the verdict, emphasizing the importance of truth, fairness, and integrity. The courtroom, once dominated by argument and technicality, had been transformed by the extraordinary power of observation. Spectators, jurors, and attorneys alike recognized that this trial would be remembered not just for its legal significance, but for the way innocence and instinct had illuminated truth in a profound and unforgettable manner. As the proceedings concluded, the child quietly pointed to the dog one last time, and the animal responded with a subtle, disciplined nod. In that silent acknowledgement lay the essence of the trial's resolution. The convergence of unfiltered perception and trained instinct had revealed what procedure alone could not. The courtroom emptied gradually, spectators whispering about the remarkable events they had witnessed, while the child and the dog remained a quiet testament to the extraordinary ways in which truth can emerge. Outside the courthouse, the story spread quickly. Journalists, community members, and social media users marveled at the rare and unexpected role played by a 3-year-old and a police dog. The case became an enduring example of how innocence and instinct could intersect to uncover reality in ways that formal logic and procedure might miss. The trial's outcome was respected not only for its adherence to law, but also for the extraordinary circumstances that had led to its resolution. In the years that followed, the child's observation and the dog's trained perception became part of local lore. Attorneys referenced the case as a unique illustration of human intuition intersecting with trained instinct. Law enforcement officers reflected on the subtle but undeniable power of observation beyond traditional evidence. And the child, growing up with the quiet knowledge of the role he had played, remained blissfully unaware that 2 simple words had reshaped an entire courtroom, leaving an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed the event. The story ended not with drama or sensationalism, but with a quiet affirmation. Truth can emerge in unexpected forms. Innocence, perception, and instinct can illuminate what logic and argument cannot. And in a small courtroom in the United States, a 3-year-old child and a police dog had reminded everyone present that sometimes the simplest observations carry the greatest weight.